Hello everyone, welcome to the True Paranormal. Today we will be discussing the experience article that I published last Friday, which documents Rhiannon's paranormal, her family encounters. And this is an experience which was shared by Rhiannon on the Overnight channel on YouTube. They have a series called Haunted Homies. So a lot of the experiences that I write about on the database are transcribed interviews from the Overnight Haunted Homies series. So this is the latest experience which was shared to them, which I've transcribed and written about. The experience itself, the Haunted Homies format, so how Elton and Corey would go about doing that is they were kind of live stage shows where Elton and Corey would who are the leaders of the Overnight team, or at least were. Corey has since left the Overnight team, but Elton and Corey would sit on the stage and they would chat about the paranormal, they would make some jokes, laugh about things, but then they would also, prior to the show, have invited their guests to write in a story to them, like a true paranormal encounter, I should say, rather than a story. Although you never know, some of them may very well be made up. But then they pick some of these experiences which have been written into them, and they then read it out on the stage, and then they invite the guest up on the stage who has sent in the experience, and they chat with them about it, they interview them. So this particular article, as I say, it transcribes Rhiannon's experience, and it also transcribes the question and answer segment done by Elton and Corey with Rhiannon. Now, this experience is a little bit different because during the question and answer segment, Rhiannon's dad, Tyler, does get invited up onto the stage as well. And so this experience is a weird one because it's more so Tyler's experience than it is Rhiannon's experience. Because even though the experience kind of occurred to Rhiannon, it was more so her dad's experience, because it's the typical creepy kid kind of experience where you notice a kid acting a bit strange. So in this case, Rhiannon is the kid, and her dad, Tyler, noticed her behaving in a strange way. So what I will do, because obviously the question and answer segment, it's a bit awkward to actually read out, because it is an interview between, well, in this one, 4 different people. So I'm not going to read out the question and answer segment. If you want to read through that, you can. It's all available in an article on the trueparanormal.blogspot.com. You are more than welcome to read through that. But what I will read instead is I will read Rhiannon's experience, and I'll read the My Thoughts segment as well, which the My Thoughts bit is probably going to be a bit out of context, because obviously I've not read out the full transcript to you in this video. But I will read the experience and I'll discuss the experience. So we'll do that. So, Rhiannon's experience. And remember, this is a story that she wrote into the Overnight team. So, a bit of backstory first. My dad was super close with my great-grandfather, and he died right around when my mum found out she was pregnant with me. So he, my great-grandfather, knew I was coming before he passed, and we had been living with my great-grandmother after my great-grandfather passed to help take care of her. I was told about this event when I was younger, but as I'm writing this, I found out this wasn't just a one-time thing. It happened multiple times. So this one day, my dad is taking me to the restroom. Since I was a toddler, this wasn't a do-it-yourself task. Before we had got into the bathroom, I stopped right in front of my great-grandmother's, which was my room my great-grandfather had passed in, and I stopped and started waving and started saying hi to him, my great-grandfather. Now, like I said a bit before, I didn't know this was something that happened more than once, and I knew of it only happening once. In this house, every time I've gone to, it feels very heavy, and this was even before I was told about my I see dead people moment I had when I was little. My mum and dad have even had weird little things happen to them there. Now, an important thing to point out about the transcribed experiences in the question and answer segment is obviously it's people talking. One of the big reasons why I wanted to document these experiences being shared in Overnight's Haunted Homies was because of the overnight team, the overnight team's insistence on joking a lot. So, for instance, that experience, you couldn't really hear what was being read that easily, and you could tell as I was reading that it probably didn't quite make sense as I was reading it. And I don't know if that's because of the way it was written. It could very well have been that Rhiannon did admit that she wrote it in a weird way. But every now and then Corey, who was reading it, would kind of pause here or there. He'd kind of laugh about things. He was reading the whole thing out in a silly voice. So yeah, it really detracts from what's being told in the story. Like I say, the experience. I really need to say experience rather than story with these, because story implies made up. And obviously, when someone has shared an experience, you don't want to immediately assume that they have made it up to get like 5 minutes of fame on YouTube, whatever. But yeah, so like I say, in terms of the transcript as well, I do cut out bits here or there because they do go off on a tangent and joke. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write it down and document it, because otherwise it's lost very, very easily. So firstly, you've got to think about the context of YouTube, right? The Haunted Homies series, each Haunted Homies video is potentially an hour long. More often than not, they're about an hour. I think there might be some short ones that are about half an hour. But yeah, and there's roughly 20 in the series, or at least in series 1, I think. This is just off memory, so this could be wrong. But there's a fair few of them. And so you've got an hour long video. Each segment like this, where it's Q&A, reading out a story or experience, is roughly 10 to 20 minutes worth of footage in that video. So already you've got about 10 minutes worth of here's an experience that we're sharing with the Q&A lost within an hour worth of footage, which is other experiences and Q&As, as well as potentially valuable information. And then you've got, amongst that experience is lost within those experiences in the wider video, which is then lost within the 20 odd in the series, which is then lost within every single video Overnight have ever made, which could be hundreds or maybe even like thousands. I don't know how many they've made, but they do have a high output, again, of videos which are at least an hour long. So that's why I wanted to transcribe these, because on the database I can add a tag of Overnight episode whatever and YouTube, and I can tag it as experience, and then straight away people can look through the tag, go, oh, experiences, click on that. Here are all the experiences split up separately. And yeah, and I will probably add more detailed tags, because obviously if I write about 10 experiences, that's very easy to find all 10. But if I write about 100 experiences, if you're seeing the most recent and you have to scroll to find the oldest ones, the oldest ones are probably going to get missed. So I'll probably add further tags to the experiences. I intend on doing the same with the locations as well, because obviously write about 10 locations, all of them are easy to find. Write about 100 and suddenly you're losing some. So I will break those down into like castle, inn, pub, I don't know. I'll have a look through, but whatever best describes them. It's like garden centre. One of them's a garden centre. Anyway, that's off topic and on a bit of a tangent. But yeah, so they're the reasons why I like to transcribe these experiences, and why when it came to sorting out what I was going to do on each Friday, I made sure that one of those Fridays was going to be documented in experience. Because it's important to do. So if you're watching and you have any experiences that you would like to be documented, please feel free to send me an email or send me a message on Facebook, and I'll reply to you, and I'll write up an article if you want me to. Please don't just make up things. Now that I've said that. But yeah, so my thoughts bit. I've already provided some thoughts. As said, they did invite Rhiannon's dad up on the stage because, as Rhiannon said, in her experience, her parents had experienced things, and her dad had seen Rhiannon standing outside of her great granddad's room. You know what? I will say though, I will say, with this particular experience that was shared, I will give credit where credit is due to the overnight team because I don't think I've mentioned that in this. I may have done, but usually, as I've already said, they joke a lot. Quite often, the transcripts are a bit of a hassle to do because I have to rewind every 5 seconds. So I'll watch about 5 seconds of footage and I'll have to rewind it and keep doing that because I can't understand what they're saying and they're laughing and they're joking and as entertaining as that is to watch, it doesn't help research. Um, but with this particular experience, it was very level-headed, calm. I did cut out a bit here or there, but it was very minute. It wasn't much time worth of footage. Um, so, yeah, and as explained as well, they invited Rhiannon's dad up on the stage because at the start of the interview it was just Rhiannon, but then they asked her questions and she kept on looking into the audience, and they were basically having the interview with her dad while he was sat in the audience, which is something I've reflected in the transcript. I do detail when the dad is in the audience and when he's up on stage, so you will know when that happens. And yeah, so he then joins her on the stage, and then they just have a normal interview again. But it is mostly him that is talking through it. So when it came to naming this article, it was a bit awkward because I was like, oh, it's Rhiannon. Like Rhiannon's the one who's written in the story, well, the experience. So it's Rhiannon who's written it in, but it's her dad who is answering most of the questions here, and it's kind of her dad's story which she has shared. Um, so it was a bit awkward, because which is why I've settled on Rhiannon's family encounters because she's talking about encountering family members after they've died. So, and it was her that encountered it. So yeah, it's like for the thumbnail. Ideally, I'd have had one with both of them in, but I couldn't fit her in that format. Um, so my thoughts, because I'm going off on a bit of a ramble. There isn't too much to go over here, as the bulk of what's discussed isn't an experience, but rather is Rhiannon's dad's involvement in the paranormal. I felt it was still important to document, as it highlights the involvement people can have. Plus if there are, plus there are a couple of interesting experiences discussed here. Firstly, you have the discussion around the children being able to see spirits. Both Rhiannon and her dad had similar experiences as children where they saw something no one else could see. For Rhiannon, it was her great-grandfather, and for her dad, it was a scarecrow. As for her dad's experience, that could be a case of him having an imaginary friend, or he could have been referencing something which could be seen at the time, but it could only be interpreted as a scarecrow to a child's imagination. In a way, this is kind of like how an SLS device would detect a chair as being a person due to it having arms and legs. It doesn't mean it's detected something that isn't visible, it's just interpreted visual stimuli differently. So I do want to go into a little bit more detail on that, because I don't know if I explained it in the best way to the article, in the article, but it's kind of like pareidolia, where you see faces and things. So the point I was making, because I didn't want to write it and it be misinterpreted as the dad was seeing something no one else could because he's a kid and therefore kids have more psychic ability, etc., which I do think is true. But kids are very imaginative, so that's the point I was trying to make. Kids are imaginative and they will look at a pencil and they will see a spaceship just as a random thing there. So they will look at something and they will interpret it as something different. They'll probably know it's not that thing that they're saying it is, but their imagination has them imagine it as some sort of crazy thing that adults wouldn't look at it and go, oh yeah, that does look like this. So when he said he saw a scarecrow, he could very well have just seen like a hat stand, like typical legs, pole, hooks coming out of it, which kind of bears a similar-ish shape to a scarecrow. So he could have seen that and gone, oh, it looks like a scarecrow. Because instead of them saying it looks like, they instead just say it is, because children have not yet learned the difference between saying something is something and something is like something. So I think that's probably what happened there. And none of the adults at the time who were with him would have looked at the thing and thought, oh yeah, you think that looks like this. it's like in the shop that I work in. There's a statue there where a lot of kids are frightened of it, but the adults don't really know why, and they don't always twig that it's the statue that they're frightened of to begin with, because the adult isn't frightened of it, so they just kind of don't register that a child might find that thing scary. Um, so they immediately think that it's like something outside the shop or whatever, you know. So, and then they go, "Oh no, it's this." Okay, that's what you're scared of. Okay, so again, could be a similar thing here, where it's the dad, when a child, had said something which to them is sensible and to them is an actual thing which everyone can see, but the adults, because they've not interpreted it that way and they've not registered it in that way, they think they can't see whatever it is. Um, so yeah, so that my long-winded explanation there is exactly why I didn't type it into the article, but I did feel it important to mention here, just to go into a little bit more detail, just to clear up any potential confusion with what I was trying to get across there. I know that I'll have said it in a rambling way, but yeah, that is probably the best I can explain it. It's why I use the SLS thing to compare, because the SLS camera does that. It looks at a table or chair or whatever. I've seen it many times where it's projected a stick figure on a chair, and then the investigators come in like, "Oh, look, it's got a spirit. A spirit is sitting in the chair." I'm just like, no, because you can see the arms of the spirit are over the arms of the chair, and the legs are kind of close to, or if not in front of, the legs of the chair. So I've just gone, no, it's just recognised arms plus legs equals person. So it's stuck a person there when really it's not. It's kind of mapped out the core of the chair as the core of the person, and stuck a head on the top of it, and then mapped the arms and legs around the arms and legs of the chair. Same thing can happen, like I say, with hat stands, with vaguely human-esque shapes, which is interesting to think that an SLS camera thinks like a child when it's trying to map stuff out. But yeah, that's what that is. It's everyone can see it. It's just being interpreted in a different way. Rhiannon's experience is a bit more complicated than her dad's. Not only does she see her great-grandfather, but it's believed she also referred to him by a name which only her dad knew. As her great-grandfather had died by the time she was born, this also makes it a little more complicated, as it does seem to rule out any potential of her having learnt that name, as discussed by her dad in the Q&A segment. And again, props to the overnight team for getting to that point. Quite often in the interviews, they can kind of skip over things or not quite ask the right questions. So for them to actually discuss the possibility of whether or not she knew the name by any means was a good point for them to have covered. Granted, it was only done in a very short, brief way. They didn't really throw out speculations of, oh, could this have happened, could this have happened, could this have happened. It was kind of a line from them, a line from the dad, end of that bit. Again, if you want to read the full thing, it is available on the database. The only rational explanations I can think of here are either a different family member told her about her great-grandfather while looking after her, or she said something similar to the nickname and this was interpreted as being the name due to the room she was saying it to, along with emotions which could have occurred at the time. This phenomena could be akin to when you think you hear an EVP say something such as hello, but someone else might hear something different. So yeah, so that point I think I wrote fairly well. Yeah, so I do think either someone was looking after, because the dad was adamant, being like, no, there's no way she'd have known the name. She was too young at the time for us to have shown her photos of him, for us to have discussed him, and so that's cool at like face value. But I do think that there's a scenario where she may have been babysat by a family member, and during that time, someone, I'm not saying that they like broke out the family album, like the photo albums or anything like that, but I do think that if she was looked after by a family member, they could have sat down and they could have discussed with her about things, or just made a comment or something like that. That is a possibility, because you wouldn't necessarily, like if you're being babysat by a family member, that family member doesn't then report everything that you discussed with the parents. So they would have never known, but it would have still sunk into her to then repeat at some point. The other, like I say, is that she was just misheard. Um, Due to the room, it could have just been a coincidental thing where she could have looked at it, and the nickname was like Papa or something like that. It different pronunciations from different people. I've spelled it in the article as Papa, but Corey pronounces it at one point as Papo, um, which is probably just American. And the dad agrees, being like, "Oh yeah, but it sounded different enough to be a different name, if that makes sense." But I've just kept it as Papa because that's what I think it was. But either way, that just means dad. That doesn't mean anything in particular. So she could have picked up that word from somewhere, and she could have maybe not been saying it to the invisible man in the room, as it were, but to her dad because her dad was present nearby. So she could have been saying it in a way to kind of call him over rather than saying, "Oh look, Papa's in the room," kind of thing. So, and that's a fairly common word, I would say. I don't know about in America, but it is a common thing. So that's what I think likely happened in order for her to have said that. Because she's not given a description. She's not said, "Oh look, this is exactly what he looks like. This is who that is to you." She's just looked in the room and said a word which, by coincidence, does have relation to that room. So there's nothing there which is strictly this is a paranormal encounter. You can imagine a scenario where she said something similar or did pick up the word from somewhere else and just said it into the room. She may have seen something in the room she may not have done. And then her dad either misheard her because, again, emotions tied with that room and that word. And, so you can kind of see how there's a scenario where it didn't happen as told, but you can see how it has become told as it is. If that makes any sense. So that's it is more complicated to explain than the dad's experience, I would say. But yeah, it's one of them. Without having been there, without knowing the exact ins and outs, without interviewing them yourself, kind of thing, there's not really anything you can determine from it as a definite. But that seems like a likely explanation. So regardless, it is an interesting experience, and it was great for the overnight team to interview Rhiannon's dad. About it, as it was more his experience than it was hers. As for Rhiannon's second experience, where she discusses thinking her sister had poked her head around the door, I think this is down to a potential psychological trick. Rhiannon says she jumped to the conclusion of it being her sister, as her sister would usually do that kind of thing. Due to this potential repetition, I think Rhiannon's mind might have hallucinated her sister doing that because it was anticipating her doing it. I've experienced this kind of thing myself, but in the form of an auditory hallucination. When I was younger, I would spend lots of time in my room, and so my parents would shout upstairs to me to let me know when my food was ready or when they wanted me to go downstairs. The repetition and anticipation of hearing my name be called led me on occasions hearing my name be called when no one was in the house. There were times when this would be the music I was listening to, which featured parts which sounded similar to my name being called, and so the anticipation led to me experiencing this. Some would put it down to paranormal activity, but I do think these kinds of auditory and visual hallucinations can be caused by repetition mixed with anticipation. It's similar to how people can easily see faces and things as anticipating something to the point of hallucinating it can be beneficial. So the point there was another story, like another experience shared by Rhiannon within the Q&A section where she said that she was in the house and she saw her sister poke her head round the door, and then she went to go and find her sister and found that her sister couldn't have done it because she was like downstairs at her desk. So yeah, that's my explanation. It's, I think, because she says that her sister would do that kind of thing often, which is why she automatically assumed, oh, it's my sister. I think it is just her mind anticipating it. Because just like with pareidolia, it's far safer to see faces than it is to miss the faces that are there. If that makes sense. So it's far safer to see faces when they're not there than to miss the ones which are. So because her sister has done that enough, I think that her mind has then um, become used to it and has therefore gone, right, survival, you're going to see that she's there just just because it's safer to see her there when she's not than the other way around. So I think that's probably what happened, and I do use the example there of auditory hallucinations, which I have experienced. Now, you could say, because again, that house was rumoured to be haunted, so you could say it's due to the hauntings in that particular house. I disagree. I do think it's a case of the mind becoming used to a particular action being performed. Um, and so, good example, Pavlov's dogs, right? That's a good example. Pavlov's dogs is a psychological experiment where Pavlov um, trained his dogs to salivate when it came to them hearing a bell. So what he would do is he would get some food. The dogs would obviously salivate because of the food, but he'd keep the dogs away from the food so they couldn't just eat it. So then they would salivate, and each time the food was brought out, he'd ring a bell. So the dogs associated the bell with the food. So when they heard the bell, even if there was no food, they would still salivate because they assumed food was about to happen. So it's a similar thing here, I think, where you could become used to a particular environmental stimulus, such as, in this case, sister poking her head around the door, and eventually your brain will be like, it's going to happen. So you'll then hallucinate it. I think that's what it is. And like I say, with the auditory thing, that's pretty much Pavlov's dogs. I'd have my name called at the time of food, so my brain, when it reached around that time of day, would then hear my name be called because I'd be anticipating food, even if there's no one in the house. So it's the same kind of thing. Like I say, sometimes that was triggered by listening to music while in my room because certain bits of songs sounded similar to it. They'd be like the same kind of tone or whatever. And with that, you could rewind and play, and you could hear exactly where it was. But other times I'd be like, no, that's just, I don't have a clue. So then I'd be like, has my name actually been called? And then I'd go downstairs and see there's no one in the house. So this experience could be very, very similar to what I have experienced. So I don't think it's paranormal. I think that is just her brain becoming trained to respond in a particular way in accordance to a particular stimuli. So the final point I want to discuss is the overnight team's lack of knowledge displayed with one particular question. Now, before I continue with this, I do want to say that, again, I want to reiterate the point of it was a good interview. They were not laughing and joking as much as they usually do, and they did raise decent points. But, yeah, there was an issue. So, benefit of the doubt would say they're just filling time and asking a question, but it is important for a team of their status to display decent knowledge about the paranormal and its evolution over time. The particular question was from Elton to Rhiannon's dad and was the following. So, I'm curious. I'm going to not read it as exactly as it's spoken. So, I'm curious, right? Because whenever we see illustrations of seances, we think of The Conjuring or we think of any of those movies. You see 8 to 9 people sitting around a table, palms up. What was your seance experience like prior to being able to just watch a video and see it? Like how to do it. There was no how-to seance videos back then. Where was this information coming from? Were you just feeling it? So, that question, as you could hear there, is Elton asking Rhiannon's dad how he knew of a seance. Like, have you done a seance? How do you know how to do a seance back then, back pre-YouTube, pre-horror films? Now, Elton has neglected a couple of facts, which he should definitely know. He should definitely know at least one of these facts. The first one, and again, this one, I don't actually know if I wrote in the article when this episode aired, but it was within the last 5 years, I'm going to say. So it's recent, right? Her dad is not going to have been born in like the 1920s. He's fairly young, but yeah. So with this particular question, Elton, the big thing he should know, which he's kind of neglected, is horror films have existed for a long time. For a long, long time. Horror films with seances in have existed for a long time. The point in particular, which I would go to, is the film The Exorcist. That was released, I believe, in the 70s. I could be wrong with that, but the 70s and the 80s were a big time for horror films. And so, yeah, Rhiannon's dad absolutely would be, at the very least, aware of The Exorcist, which does depict a Ouija board being used by a child. So, already with that one film alone, you've got the depiction of a Ouija board and how to use it. And that's information I'd expect the overnight channel to know. Now, granted, films back then were very different from now. You obviously didn't have YouTube or anything like that, so if you wanted to see a trailer for a film, you would have to go and see a film to see the trailer before it. You'd then see film posters put up around the place. You'd see bits in newspapers, etc., advertising it, because obviously TV was not as big as it is now. You may have adverts on TV. I'm not too sure on what TV was like back then, aside from it existed. But yeah, so it was very different. You didn't really know what was coming out, so it was very possible to go and see a film without having seen any footage whatsoever of that film beforehand. It's why certain films like The Exorcist would have been so shocking to people. It's like I remember seeing a trailer for The Birds, or was it Psycho? I think it was Psycho, with Alfred Hitchcock, and it was the trailer was literally Alfred Hitchcock walking around the set, implying things. He was just kind of every sentence he said was a cliffhanger, um, to build intrigue about the film, about the setting of it, etc. So it was a very different time back then. But as I say, even though it wouldn't have been in people's homes as such, so you wouldn't be able to just be sat at home, open up a YouTube video and go, oh, look, that's how you do it. It was still, people would have seen it and been aware of it. They'd have heard rumours about, which in a way would have made it spookier. Um, but ignoring that point, which again, that's the point which Elton, I assume, would definitely know or should know. Um, Ouija boards and spiritualism in general date back to, I believe, the 1800s, probably older than the 1800s. I know, obviously, you can go back to religions, and it's like the article that I'm currently in the process of writing is about a particular book of magical practices, and that is rumored to date to around the 1700s. But well, I think it does date to the 1700s, but it's rumored to date back to like the 1200s, um, and biblical times and all of that. So I'm pretty sure. Um, sorry, I just got distracted by a notification there. So I'm pretty sure that I'm very distracted by that notification. Um, yeah, if you haven't seen Beto Get Scared, please go and watch his channel because that's what the notification was. I've just been distracted by, um, because I'm now intrigued to watch that video, and I've completely lost my track of thought. Um, Curse you, Beto. Yeah, completely gone. Oh no, I've remembered it. It's the other point. Yeah, so spiritualism and the paranormal and interactions, summoning and seances and all that date back far further. The traditional sitting around a table seance, I believe, was Victorian times, so around the 1800s. Um, and yeah, so it's been around for a while. One of the interesting things I found out about Ouija boards was that the White House did have a Ouija board in it. Seances were conducted in the White House at one point because they were that well known and that prominent. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for instance, was a spiritualist and was an influential figure regarding the promotion of communicating with spirits. And again, that was kind of early 1900s. So maybe earlier. I'm not sure, but off the top of my head at least. So Yeah, there's it's been around for a while, and again, I would expect the overnight team to know that they've investigated so many places. They've investigated the Warren Museum. They've done big stuff in the paranormal, but to ask about how you know about seances and make it seem like, oh, during that time you wouldn't have known. How do you know? Um, no, that's not particularly what they said, but um, he drew attention saying that when we see it now, we see it from the Conjuring films. Um, and yeah, and he says, what was it like before you could watch a video and see how to do it? Well, the answer is you could see a video and know how to do it because horror films existed, and even before then, people were well aware of how to do it. At least I assumed that they were well aware. When the Fox sisters ended up doing their thing, it did spread like wildfire, so everyone would have been aware to some degree. So even the Warrens with their investigations, which is why, again, I'd expect the overnight channel to know this, they have been interviewed and they did say about the danger of Ouija boards. So you'd think that the overnight team would know that, Rhiannon's daddy's not that old. He'll definitely have seen The Exorcist and have been aware of these things if everyone else was. So yeah, it just came across as a bit of an odd question, and it, like you say, demonstrates a lack of knowledge. Now, it could have just been done to use up the time. It could have just been to continue the conversation. I'm aware in the interview format, not every question you ask is going to sound particularly relevant, but yeah, for a team of their standards and standing, I'm like, that's it displays a lack of knowledge, and this is something that I unfortunately tend to find when watching these videos. Um, that a lack of knowledge can be displayed here or there, and this is why I do what I do because I want to try and promote the knowledge. Granted, my memory is awful, so I don't know it off the top of my head, but at least the articles are there for people to read and to learn. Um, so, because I did go off on a bit of a rambly tangent there, that particular question is, in one aspect, smart as it acknowledges how modern investigations are likely influenced by modern paranormal horror media such as the Conjuring franchise and YouTube videos. However, Elton hasn't acknowledged the Conjuring franchise was based on the real cases of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who did investigations during the 1970s. You could say he didn't acknowledge this because they're one isolated team, but spiritualism has been around for far longer. Claims that you could conduct seances and communicate through the spirits tapping on walls has been around since the 1800s. It was during the March of 1848 that the Fox sisters first claimed spiritual communication through these knocks. I wouldn't expect the overnight team to know the specific dates, but I would expect them to know seances have been in public knowledge for a long time. Even if they didn't know how long ago seances dated back, The Exorcist was released during 1973, and the presence of horror films is something Rhiannon's dad does point out. Aside from that one criticism, I think that Elton and Corey did well during this interview. It isn't uncommon for these interviews conducted by them to go off the rails with jokes, but this interview stayed mostly on track and was a genuine, serious discussion about the experiences shared. I do think that these experiences can be explained by psychology, and I would have liked to have seen the overnight team question that aspect a bit more, but it was still interesting regardless. So yeah, so you can see there, I mentioned The Exorcist was released in 1973, and the Fox sisters were the 80s, not the 80s, were the 1800s. But as I say in there, I don't expect them to know the dates. I don't know the dates off the top of my head. I only knew about Exorcist being 1973 because I did Google it while writing the article, but I was aware it was around the time of the 70s, just as I've been aware that the Fox sisters were around the time of the 1800s. So I would expect them to know, at the very least, it's been around for at least 100 years. Everyone on the planet should have been aware of it when they were younger. Um, so yeah, because even if you're 100 years old right now, that puts you to 1920s. So you'll have known about it growing up in the 30s because everyone else did, and especially around that time because of wars, etc. Like, I'm sure the statistics showing that whenever there is some sort of conflict where there's a loss of life, um, belief in the paranormal and talk of it does increase quite a lot. A good example earlier on I said about the White House conducting seances. That is, if I'm right in thinking this, Abraham Lincoln and his wife both lost children to the American Civil War, and so that's why they conducted seances in the White House, because they wanted to communicate with the kids they'd lost in that war. Um, I could again be wrong with that, but that's from memory what it is. So all the time, whenever there's any conflict, anyone's undertaking any sort of grief, belief in the paranormal does increase because everyone doesn't really want to say goodbye. They want them, they want the loved ones, etc., to kind of be hanging around in some respect, um, and so they will explore whether or not the paranormal is real. Thank you very much for watching. That was a bit of a somber note to leave it on, but yeah, it's a good experience. Like I say, it was a good interview from them in respect to it was mostly on track and mostly serious, and they seemed respectful of Rhiannon and of her dad. Sometimes in these interviews, it feels like there's a bit of a lack of respect from the team towards the guest, but other times it's like this, where it's just sitting down, having a serious discussion, and that's always good because it adds validity to that experience as well, I feel. Because if they're laughing and joking about it, it's kind of taking the mick out of it, and it's kind of been like, oh, it's not really real, is it? But if they're properly sitting down and discussing, having a serious conversation, it just makes it all feel more legitimate than if they made it up, or if the team think that they've made it up. There are interesting experiences in that series, so please, if you haven't already, please go and watch the Haunted Homies series for overnight. The second series I don't think is as good. I've not properly sat down and watched an episode of that properly yet, though. The first series was really good because it was a very limited, self-contained stage show type thing. Whereas the second series is more of a comedy gig stand-up performance, which already through this video you'll know how I feel about their jokes being inserted into people's experiences, and I don't know if they invited people up on stage to share experiences with that either. So first series is better, so please, if you haven't, go and watch that. It is linked in the article, and like the one I've read out is linked in the article. So yeah, because I think that's episode 5 of the Haunted Homies series that this experience has come from. There is a very interesting one in the future, which I'm looking forward to reaching and transcribing, because I've not seen all the episodes. I think I saw some, like maybe the first 10 at most. But there's someone called Dan. His last name might be Rivera, something along those lines. But he works at the Conjuring House, and I know that in a future experience discussion, he is the one being interviewed. So I'm looking forward to that, and he's involved in some of the interviews as well, I think. So that will be a very good episode for me to eventually reach. But we'll get there when we get there. In the meantime, there's plenty of experiences, and like I say, if you do have your own paranormal experiences, please feel free to contact me on Facebook or by email. And we can have a discussion about it, and I can write it up as an article if you want. Or we can just have a discussion about it. You might be like, oh, what's this thing I'm experiencing? And I might be able to provide an answer for you. Obviously, it might not be the answer, but it might be an alternative explanation that you haven't yet heard. So thank you very much, everyone, for watching. And if you've watched this on YouTube, thank you for that as well. I will be live on TikTok, because it is Wednesday today, so I'll be live there at 8 o'clock if you're seeing this before that. But if not, then next Wednesday, 8 o'clock, I will be live on TikTok. And that will just be discussing, like, just chatting with everyone and building. So, yeah, thank you very much, and goodbye.